In this video, we'll be going over the 10 best dungeons in World of Warcraft's history, up to Battle For Azeroth anyway. And at number 10, we have the Halls of Reflection. This dungeon was the perfect culmination of a 3-dungeon storyline structure, where they told a continuous story that spanned across 3 different dungeons, starting with the Forge of Souls and then ending in the Halls of Reflection, where you're trying to strike a blow to Arthas and maybe steal the Frostmourne from him. And then at the end of the dungeon, you face off against one of the scariest boss fights in the game, where all you have to do is just run away from Arthas, who slowly walks towards you, which is probably one of the best jobs Blizzard has done in really selling how powerful the final boss of the expansion is. Halls of Reflection is remembered very fondly by a lot of players, although it's not without its faults. You may be surprised to hear this, but it was not well liked at its time. People would just leave the dungeon if they got placed into Halls of Reflection through the dungeon queue, because people really did not like that it was basically a very long ad fight. The first 2 bosses would show up after you cleared out 5 waves of ads, and you kinda just had to wait for them to spawn after you cleared them out. And they were kind of difficult, so you had to fight most of them inside a corner in the side of the room in order to deal with them effectively. So you basically spent half the dungeon huddled up in the side of a small corner, and then you hop out every 5 waves in order to fight an easy boss. Then at the end of the dungeon, you would just run away from Arthas, which entailed just killing more ads, while Jaina or Sylvanas destroyed the ice wall that was blocking your path. So the actual mechanics of the place were not very exciting, and it was kind of tedious to go through the gauntlet at the beginning, because it was kind of long and difficult. But it was very cool thematically, and it was very well loved in hindsight, so it definitely has to take a spot on this list, if at the lowest spot at number 10. And at number 9, we have the Scarlet Monastery. This dungeon, which first appeared in Vanilla WoW and was revamped in MoP, kind of popularized the short dungeons we have today, over the long, expansive, exploratory ones that were the norm in Classic WoW. And it turns out, players really liked short dungeons. People would speedrun this place all the time to farm it out to level out other people's ults, mainly because it was actually repeatable, as it was a lot shorter than all the others. Technically, there were 4 Scarlet dungeons, and all of them were kind of short as well, but Scarlet Monastery was definitely the most popular of the 4. So, whether you love or hate them, Scarlet Monastery was definitely one of the main ancestors to the short dungeons we have today, and is very iconic and influential because of it. Although whether it was well liked as some of the higher spots in this list is probably up for debate, and some people might consider short dungeons a bad thing, so it only gets the number 9 spot. And at number 8, we have Grimrail Depot, a surprise hit from the Warlords of Draenor expansion. Basically in this dungeon, for the second half of it, you ride in a train as you fight. So if you look off to the side, you can just see the zone flying by, and it's done in a seamless loop where you can't really tell when it changes. And honestly, this is probably one of the few raids in the game which is very fondly remembered for its aesthetic alone, besides maybe this and the Halls of Reflection. Halls of Reflection is definitely fondly remembered for its aesthetic as well. However, people actually liked doing Grimrail Depot as well, which was not the case for Halls of Reflection in its time period. So what about the bosses, trash, and mechanics of the place? Well, honestly, it's not super memorable on that front. One of the bosses required you to do line of sight mechanics, and line of sight mechanics aren't super fun for a lot of people, but it was kind of a minor part of it anyway. The other ones are all pretty standard stuff and didn't really do anything special when it came to bosses or trash packs. But it wasn't annoying, which was a huge step up from Halls of Reflection. So, since its aesthetics were super cool, it was very widely remembered as one of the best dungeons from Warlords of Draenor, and often comes up in debates about what the best dungeons in the game were. Grimrail Depot being on this list should give you a good indication of how much aesthetic can carry a dungeon. And at number 7, we have the Stonecore from Cataclysm. The Stonecore is probably one of the hardest dungeons in the game's history, when it comes to boss fights. As when I created my video on the hardest dungeon boss fights in the game's history, I had 2 bosses from the Stonecore on that list originally, before I had to remove one of them just so I wouldn't have repeats from the same dungeon in the video. You see, its 3rd boss, Osrook, had a couple of mechanics on it which could basically wipe the group if you didn't know what you were doing. One of them was a simple melee AoE, where the melee people had to run out when he was performing a certain stomp, otherwise he would instantly kill them, which is pretty standard boss tactics. It's just he had this other ability he would usually cast before it, which would stun the entire group for 10 seconds, and the only way to break this stun was to take damage. So the way you would take damage on yourself was through two different methods depending on how you were fighting him. Periodically throughout the fight, he would cast a spell reflection shield on himself. So if you were a spellcaster, you simply had to use one of your dot abilities so that you would take damage on yourself for when he performed the stun. And if you were a melee character, you would just periodically get a bleed if you attacked him normally, so they could break themselves out of the stun pretty easily by just doing their normal rotation. And if you were a class which did not have a dot, you kinda had to rely on your healer to dispel you and for them to have done the mechanic properly. Otherwise, the group would wipe. Which happened quite often because this is kind of an intricate and difficult mechanic for a random dungeon group to accomplish. There's a reason they stopped having hard raid mechanics in dungeons after Cataclysm. Players on a whole cried for harder dungeons, and then when they got them, they cried for easier dungeons of Wrath of the Lich King to return, and that's kind of what we've had ever since. The first boss of the dungeon was also difficult. He'd have an instant kill mechanic where he burrowed during the raid and would come up and kill people who weren't fast enough to move out of his little smoke cloud. It also spawned adds which needed to be AoE down quickly, otherwise they would overrun the group. Even the second boss had a line of sight mechanic where you had to avoid his AoE by running behind a rock wall, otherwise it would kill you. So, 3 of its 4 bosses had instant kill mechanics on par with raid bosses, and a lot of players look fondly back on how difficult Azeroth really was, which is why the Stonecore definitely was one of the better dungeons in the game's history. It really showed the full potential of a hard dungeon with intricate boss mechanics, and why they don't really work with WoW's player base, outside of maybe mythic-only dungeons. And at number 6, we have the Sunken Temple from Vanilla WoW. This dungeon is basically the complete opposite of the Scarlet Monastery. It was a huge exploratory dungeon with multiple levels and floors, hidden rooms, and even an entire section of the dungeon dedicated to a hidden boss, which wouldn't even spawn unless you clicked on the 6 statues in the room in the correct order, which were surrounded by mobs you had to kill in order to even attempt the puzzle. And this place was ran quite frequently because it was required for a whole bunch of class quests that were near max level, which awarded great rewards for players in those level ranges. You could spend all day in the Sunken Temple trying to clear it out and not succeed, because it was just so massive and had so many bosses. Of course, this isn't really experienced in Classic WoW, since everyone knows the place, so it was more of a product of its time. Now, the reason this place is remembered is because it's one of the earliest gigantic dungeons you can run, as you could first do the place at level 45, and it's bigger than some modern raids even, as the Vanilla WoW version had a total of 9 bosses. Although when this place was revamped for Cataclysm, they completely gutted it, and removed the multiple levels and half the dungeon altogether, bringing it down to a grand total of 3 bosses you can kill, which makes it much easier to complete through the dungeon finder when you're leveling up, but to call the modern version a shell of its former self is kind of an understatement, as it has less than 1/3 of the amount of content that it used to have. The only way to experience the gigantic version is to play Classic WoW. And the revamp they did to this place kind of explains why people wanted an old version of WoW to exist, because sometimes they pull things like the Sunken Temple revamp. And at number 5, we have the Shadow Labyrinth from the Burning Crusade. The Shadow Labyrinth was a very well-liked dungeon because it was required to run for Karazhan, so pretty much everyone had to do it. And it had this sense of progression over the dungeon that felt like it was getting harder the further along you progressed towards the end. Now, the Burning Crusade was kind of known for having hard trash. A lot of people fondly remember Burning Crusade Dungeon as being incredibly difficult, and 90% of that was because of how hard the trash was. You were basically forced to CC or pull things smartly, otherwise you can get wiped very quickly if you tried to mass pull. The Shadow Labyrinth wasn't very much different on that front, although it wasn't the hardest out of all the Burning Crusade trash. Shadow Labyrinth did have 2 interesting bosses. One of them was Blackheart the Inciter, who had this really unique mechanic where, periodically throughout the fight, he would mind control the entire party in order to force them to fight each other. Now, there are some fights where mind control takes place, but not really ones where it's part of the fight for everyone to occasionally start punching each other with their characters, which is a unique mechanic that doesn't really exist in modern fights even today, and was either loved or hated by many. The final boss, Murmur, wasn't really that unique. It even is kind of just a reskinned model of Ragnaros, but the room you entered in order to fight the boss room really felt hectic, as the Shadow Council members were trying their best to rein in this unstoppable monster that they accidentally summoned. As in lore, Murmur is kind of a god that can destroy planets, and is technically one of the strongest bosses based on lore because of this. and he's just kind of located in this random dungeon, which just adds to the dungeon's charm even more. And at number 4, we have the Deadmines from Vanilla WoW and Cataclysm. This was one of the first dungeons that the Alliance players had access to, and it was actually kinda good. It was the culmination of the questing in the Westfall Zone, which was one of the most played through zones in the game because of how many players went Alliance and played Human. And it was kind of the gold standard for Blizzard internally when it came to designing dungeons. In the WoW Diary book, the one that explains the development of Vanilla WoW, they described the Deadmines as the dungeon in which they would measure other dungeons' length to. Where, if it was shorter than the Deadmines, then it was considered a short dungeon. But if it was longer than the Deadmines, then it was considered one of their longer dungeons. And it was a lot better than the Horde intro dungeon, Ragefire Chasm, which was kind of just an underground lava pit that had you fight no-name demons. Whereas the Deadmines culminated with the fight against Van Cleef. In Cataclysm, they had a revamp for the dungeon, but unlike the Sunken Temple, they actually put effort into the Deadmines revamp and basically remade the whole thing rather than just neutering it. Mainly because they also converted it into a heroic mode, so the max level players could do it as well. And it even has one of the longest final bosses in any dungeon. As when you fight Vanessa Van Cleef, there's a part in the fight where you have to run through the entire dungeon again to find her. So honestly, both versions of this dungeon are kind of good, which cannot be said about all the other remakes. And at number 3, we have the Return to Karazhan dungeon in Legion. This was Blizzard's first mega dungeon they added to the game, which is basically a long-form dungeon which only has a mythic mode available to it. So it's kind of like a 5-person raid to an extent, and it was very fitting that they used Karazhan as a model for it, since it literally was a raid from the Burning Crusade. And a very well-loved one at that, but this wasn't the first time they'd converted a raid into a dungeon. Back in the Cataclysm, they had also converted 2 of the troll raids into heroic-only dungeons, which is kind of the same thing to an extent. So Karazhan was more like the first longer raid, which was converted into a high-level dungeon. And what was great about a mega dungeon was the fact that you could accomplish it with a smaller, tight-knit group, and expect to spend about a full raid's worth of time in there. It was an excellent experimental idea, which they did again with Mechagon, and again succeeded since it was a very well-liked dungeon in BFA. Eventually, they split the dungeon into 2 parts for the Mythic Plus mode. Since people liked Karazhan so much, they wanted it to be part of the rotation for Mythic Plus. Although there was lots of complaints about the 2 modes in that particular version of running dungeons, since Karazhan wasn't really made for Mythic Plus running. So with Mechagon, they obviously thought of this beforehand, and it was also a lot more suited for being split into 2 parts. Overall, I think the Mega Dungeon idea has been a success so far, since they basically hit 2 out of 2 with excellent Mega Dungeons. So I'm excited to see more mid-expansion Mega Dungeons being added in the future, and if anything, they should add more than 1 Mega Dungeon each expansion. And at number 2, we have the Culling of Stratholme from the Wrath of the Lich King. This dungeon is very well liked because of its lore, and was probably a lot of people's first time seeing what happened at the Culling of Stratholme with Arthas, as I'm sure there's many people who play WoW who've never played Warcraft 3, which was definitely me as well during Wrath of the Lich King. This was my first time seeing this story and I thought it was amazing. Basically, all of the Infinite Dragonflight dungeons are just ways for Blizzard to show major events that happened in the past, and give the player a reason to interact with them. And the Culling of Stratholme is a unique point in WoW's history, which is both super important in lore, and is perfectly suited for players to actually help out the characters whose story you're learning about. In the original Culling of Stratholme, Arthas did not do it alone, and in fact had the help of his men, so you simply take on the role of some of his men who helped him perform the culling, whereas most of the other ones kind of have to stretch the story a bit to explain why your characters are there interacting with this major lore event. It's super easy to just drop in no-name adventurers into this one, and I think that's probably what led to its memorable status, and why it's so fondly talked about in these kinds of discussions about the best dungeons. Sure, there was also the usual time dragon shenanigans, where you did have to fight them at a couple of points throughout the dungeon, but I don't think that really detracts from it very much. And another thing about the dungeon, definitely something else that led to the dungeon's popularity even more, was the fact that it dropped a guaranteed mount every time you did it, the Reigns of the Bronze Drake. All you had to do was kill an optional side boss before the last one and you got it for everyone in your party. And players love to earn easy mounts, so this thing basically had everything going well for it. Lore about Warcraft's most famous and beloved villain, a dungeon which didn't take very long to complete, and free mounts. But the actual mechanics of the boss fights and the trash were pretty standard. Even so, this is probably one of the most remembered dungeons in the game, which can show you just how much lore can enhance a dungeon, whereas Grimrail Depot can show you how much aesthetic can, although the number 1 spot is more about an actual dungeon crawling experience. And at number 1, we have Blackrock Depths from Vanilla WoW. BRD is a massive 21 boss dungeon, which might make it straight up the largest instance in the game, which is chock full of all kinds of things. There are so many bosses in BRD that you could easily spend half a day in there if you knew what you were doing, or it could take you a couple of days to complete everything if you didn't. The dungeon wasn't linear, so you could choose where to go and who to kill and how to get there. The further you got into the dungeon, the stronger the mobs became, just like in the Shadow Labyrinth, although it was a much more noticeable increase in power. There was tons of quests associated to the dungeon, far more than any other dungeon, and several of those quests required you to leave the dungeon in order to accomplish something hard before coming back. So it would encourage people to go out into the world and really connect to the dungeon as something that existed within the world. There were lots of patterns and schematics that dropped from NPCs where it made sense for them to drop them, like engineers dropping parts for repair bots or world enlargers. The dungeon was basically a raid in every sense of the word, except the fact that it was designed as a 5-man dungeon, and puts all of the mega dungeons to shame with how much smaller they are in comparison to this behemoth. And the reason this dungeon existed this way is because in Vanilla WoW, before the game launched, Blizzard thought players would only do a dungeon once. You see, in nearly every other MMO at the time besides like one of them, all of the dungeons and raids were open world. So if you wanted to raid, you had to find other guilds for the privilege of being able to kill the bosses. And because of this, farming a raid every week in order to get your best piece of equipment wasn't really a common thing. And true instance dungeons hadn't really been mainstream at that point yet. And one of the only other MMOs on the market which did have instance dungeons, which means dungeons that don't exist in the open world, and have different versions for the different groups that enter them, they only had Diablo-style rooms where everything was randomly generated. So World of Warcraft kind of pioneered purposefully designed instance dungeons, and the standard at the time was to only complete dungeons once because of how all the other dungeons worked. So they made the dungeons as big as possible because they wanted that one time to be memorable. And in fact, they wanted to make BRD even bigger, but thought it was already big enough as is. And then when players finally got to do the place, they were kind of annoyed that they had to re-clear the entire thing every week in order to farm out the gear they wanted. It turns out players like the big dungeons the first time they do them, but they like the gear even better, and then it became really annoying by the time they had to farm the place and do them repeatedly. And they also found that people really loved the shorter room-style dungeons like Scarlet Monastery, and since they loved the short ones so much, and hated having to re-clear the gigantic 21 boss version, that's why they kind of abandoned the idea going into the future. And all future dungeons were kind of modeled after the Scarlet Crusade dungeons. So if you ever wondered why we don't have gigantic raid-like dungeons like BRD, it's because they weren't really well liked by competitive players who had to farm them for their BIS gear. And the hardcore community liked the smaller repeatable ones much more. So it's kind of Blizzard just giving the players what they want to an extent, and what they don't want was large dungeons, which seems like that would be a really good new model to add. Large exploratory dungeons that you can only do once. Alright, and that's the video. This video idea was made the request of one of my gold tier Patreons named Arcast, so if you like the video, you have him to thank for it. If you think there's any other dungeons that I may have missed that definitely should have been in this video, I'd love to hear about them as well as ideas for future videos just like this one down in the comments. And also, short little plug, I launched a new D&D top 10 channel. If you like my scripted, highly edited top 10s on this channel, and have a passing interest in Dungeons & Dragons, you should totally check out that channel as well, as it's basically the same thing, as it will be linked in the video description at the end of the video right now.